And so, as I was saying, that one of the things that Derrida doesn't tell you about Tote is that Tote is the god who is associated with the balance of the scales, that in the afterlife the soul of the dead comes to its day of judgment, and its heart has to be weighed against a feather of truth, the goddess Mat, who's the goddess of truth, and Tote is the god who records the results. He stands there and watches the way the scale is set, and he writes the results down. So he's the god who is linked with the scales in the underworld. But the judgment of the dead is a myth that came about in ancient Egypt in the Middle Kingdom. It wasn't there in the Old Kingdom, but Tote is a much older god. If you read the pyramid texts, you find him in the pyramid texts doing a number of interesting things, one of which is that he is the god that goes back and forth between Horus and Set. Horus and Set are brothers. They're opposites. They personify the sun versus the moon, and also the two solstices, the summer solstice versus the winter solstice. Horus is the sun god. He's the god of the north. Set is the god of the moon and of the winter solstice and the god of the south. And the two solstices on the horizon, through the course of the year, the sun moves at its furthest point north on the summer solstice, and then at its furthest point south in the winter solstice. And so through the course of the year, it's almost like an eye, or it's in an oscillating attractor that bounces back and forth, and it's thought to be imagined as the eye of Horus. The right eye of Horus is the sun. The left eye is actually the moon. The right eye of Horus is the sun. And in the battle between Horus and Set, Horus loses his eye. And the reason he loses it is because Set goes and grabs it and takes it back to the winter solstice, basically absconds with it to the underworld. Tote is the god who, between them, has to go and get the eye and bring it back to Horus. He keeps bringing it back. And so the scales are originally associated with the vernal equinox. Later this becomes, of course, the astrological sign of Libra, the scales there. That's an echo of Tote's original role as adjudicator in the conflict between Horus and Set, and the role of the vernal equinox, which is directly in between the two solstices, in which you have equal light, equal dark, and Tote is the lord who regulates that function. So he was originally an astronomical deity, and he was always a mortuary deity, and he was always linked with the association of as the inventor of writing. And indeed, writing, in a certain sense, Plato's myth is a made-up myth, but in saying that writing came from Tote and that Tote is a mortuary god is a way, it basically is true in the sense that writing in Egypt did originate in a mortuary context. Unlike in ancient Mesopotamia, it came out of the cult of the dead. The earliest origins for writing in Egypt comes from the tomb of the Scorpion King about 3200 BC, where we find these bone and ivory plaque seals with the first hieroglyphs that have been engraved upon them, and they're linked with the tomb of the Scorpion King as identifying marks. So writing did indeed come out of the cult of the dead, and in a sense was then introduced by a mortuary deity like Tote to the great solar god as supplemental. Whereas unlike in ancient Mesopotamia, writing originates in the context of business transactions. It was simply used to keep account of transactions, donations of sheep and grain and animals to the great ziggurats, the great temples. And so it has a business origin there. So it does come out of the cult of the dead. But the point that Derrida, in his disquisition on the god Tote, wants to make is that Tote has all of these different functions. He's a god who exists in Egyptian mythology as a floating signifier. He is not something that can be assigned to a particular fixed slot that just stays there, like one of Plato's metaphysical concepts, or any of the great metaphysical concepts of the logocentric tradition. He's a floating signifier. He corresponds to the joker in the deck of cards that can take on its identity. It's a floating signifier because it can take on whatever identity you want to give to it. And it is therefore a trace. Tote functions in Egyptian mythology analogous to the way the pharmacon functions in Plato's Phaedrus, as a floating signifier that is an undecidable. It moves around through the system as a trace that cuts across metaphysical oppositions and destabilizes them, makes them shift and float, and institutes the différance, or the play of significations that sets systems in motion again. And so what Derrida is trying to do then in this text is to try to restore this sense of the play of significations that existed, I suppose, more in the mythological consciousness structure than it does in the metaphysical tradition of the mental consciousness structure that begins to stabilize from Plato and Aristotle on down, where the structures become more fixed based on metaphysical pairs of opposites such as inside, outside, presence, absence, speech, writing, that take on a fixity that in the mythical consciousness structure such beings like the god Tote did not have, because they were much more flexible. They were sliding signifiers. They slide, like Derrida's traces, across a realm of significations. Derrida had been reading Joyce at this point, and you can see the influence of Finnegan's Wake on his thinking, I think, in this text. He even mentions Finnegan's Wake at one point, in which in Finnegan's Wake, every word that Joyce comes up with has multiple meanings and perfectly exemplifies the Derridian idea of the play of multiple significations, sliding signifiers moving across the surface of discourse, instead of just fixed, engraved in stone metaphysics of presence in which speech is elevated over writing and writing is merely a supplement. But then, as Derrida says, then the trace is the supplement, and the supplement not only is supplemental to that which it substitutes for, but it can also supplant what it substitutes for. Writing comes in. The way the way King Tammuz regards writing as something that he's aloof from, is the exemplar of the metaphysics of presence, and doesn't really have any need for. So writing is always exterior. It's regarded on the outside, Derrida says, but yet his fear that it might erode and destabilize the oral tradition of rote memorization and of great rhapsodes and bards like Homer. In India, an entire civilization was built out of memorizing texts, or not actual written texts, because they didn't have much need for writing. Writing in India was even less privileged than it has been in the metaphysical tradition of the West, or even in Egypt, where the memory was everything, and the entirety of the great metaphysical tradition in India is based on incredible feats of memorization. An individual will be trained by a guru to memorize a text, and he'll spend his whole life memorizing every line of that text. A little bit like the characters at the end of Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451, each one of whom has dedicated him or herself to memorizing one of the classics, a Jane Austen novel, say, because they've all been burnt. So the only way to preserve a text when the physical substrate has been undermined from the text is oral rote memorization. So the idea of the trace being supplemental is that it can also get on the inside of that which it substitutes for, and because it's slippery in terms of its play of significations, it can destabilize it and rupture it from within. And so there's a fear on the part of King Tammuz when he dismisses Tote's offer of writing, that he knows that writing will, as indeed it did, efface and destroy the oral tradition, and it will pose a threat to the logocentric presence of speech and authority and the metaphysics of presence, the association of the signifier with the psyche, with the living breath that animates it. In The Pit and the Pyramid, the previous Derrida text, we saw how Hegel had associated the sign with the pyramid as a tomb, a dead thing, being associated thereby with death, and that which animated it, the living breath of the psyche that animates it. There's a similar idea there. Writing is always, it turns up in all of these contexts in the association with death. So it's not an accident that Derrida focuses here on Tote, a mortuary god, who is introducing writing the same way that in the Hegel text he had talked about Hegel's association of writing with the pyramid. Again, a mortuary context, because from Plato to Hegel there's this association of writing, and it's in Rousseau as well, that writing is secondary, it's supplementary, it's not the real authentic thing. It's a supplement, it's exterior to speech, it simply exists as the absence of the writer. It's a pure husk that's left behind in lieu of the actual living authoritative presence of the writer. And Derrida wants to deconstruct this, and so this is what he talks about in this essay about how the trace then comes in and destabilizes all these traditional metaphysical oppositions and their absoluteness. So this is basically the gist of the first half of Plato's Pharmacy, with his introduction of the trace and the undecidable, with the discussion of Plato's Pharmacy. And of course, Plato's Pharmacy, just to conclude here, Plato's Pharmacy is itself the metaphysical tradition of the West, the concepts of which are the pharmacons, the prescriptions. Every concept is a prescription designed to immunize some sort of an ontological problem. And so Plato's Pharmacy is the tradition stocked full of the Western medicine chest, stocked full of ontological concepts and ideas designed to immunize, I suppose, the psyche against the impacts of the real. Metaphysics, as Peter Sloterdijk has said, is applied immunology. And so that's my discussion then of the first half of Plato's text, or of Derrida's Plato's Pharmacy.